He was just a security guard. Nobody looked twice at the man in the cheap uniform standing by the gate in the rain. Nobody asked his name. Nobody cared. But when three armed men moved through the darkness toward the woman who had just arrived, when the threat was real and the seconds were running out, Nathan Cole didn't reach for a radio. He reached for something buried much deeper than that. The man everyone ignored was about to remind the world exactly what he was capable of. If stories like this are what you live for, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. Let's see how far this one travels. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next will keep you up at night. The storm came in fast off the coast, the way bad things usually did. Without warning, without mercy, and with absolutely no concern for whoever happened to be standing in its path. Nathan Cole was standing in its path. He'd been at his post since 6 in the evening, and by 9 o'clock the rain was coming sideways, cutting through his jacket like the fabric wasn't even there. The gatehouse at Harrow Ridge Estates was a small structure, glass on 3 sides, a space heater that worked about 60% of the time, a laminated sheet of resident names taped above the monitor bank. Tonight the heater was in its other 40%, and Nathan had given up trying to fix it around hour 2. He sat on the stool with his hands wrapped around a thermos of cold coffee and watched the storm move through the tree line, bending the old oaks along the private road like they were made of wire. He'd worked this gate for 14 months. It wasn't the kind of job that inspired conversation at dinner parties. Not that Nathan went to dinner parties. He buzzed people in. He wrote down license plates. He checked delivery manifests and waved through residents who barely registered that a human being was operating the gate at all. The Harrow Ridge community was home to 14 families, most of them the kind of wealthy that stopped thinking about money the same way ordinary people stopped thinking about air. They breathed it. It was just there. To them, Nathan was part of the infrastructure, like the irrigation system or the private road maintenance crew. Necessary, invisible, replaceable. He didn't mind. Invisibility had its advantages. He'd learned that in a different life. The monitor on the left side of the control panel showed the outer gate camera feed, rain-distorted and gray. The one on the right showed the main road running parallel to the estate's stone wall for about 200 yards before it curved out of frame. Nathan checked them every few minutes out of habit. Not because he expected anything, but because watching exits and entry points was something his nervous system still did without being asked. 14 months of nothing. He poured the last of the cold coffee into the lid of the thermos and drank it. Sophie had texted him at 7:30. "Mrs. Aldrin let me stay for dinner. She made that pasta you like. I saved you some, but I ate most of it. Sorry." He'd written back, "That's okay. Go to bed before 10. She'd sent a thumbs up, which was her way of saying she'd heard him without committing to anything. 12 years old going on 40. His daughter had his eyes and her mother's mouth and a way of looking at the world that still caught him off guard sometimes, sideways and assessing, like she was always checking the angles. He missed her mother every day. He missed her differently now than he had in the beginning. In the first year, it had been like a wound that wouldn't close, something raw and catastrophic that made the simple act of getting out of bed feel like a mission briefing with no clear objective. Now, 3 years later, it was more like a scar, present, permanent, occasionally painful when something pressed against it the wrong way. He'd spent a lot of time in the last 3 years trying not to press against it. The outer gate camera flickered. Nathan set down the thermos lid and leaned toward the monitor. A pair of headlights was coming up the main road. Nothing unusual. It was still early enough for residents to be returning from whatever wealthy people did on Tuesday nights. But something about the way the car was moving nagged at him. Too slow, uncertain. The kind of driving that happened when someone was watching the road behind them and not just ahead. It was a silver Mercedes sedan, late model. He didn't recognize it, but that wasn't unusual for guests. He pulled up the visitor log for the evening, nothing scheduled. He watched the car pull up to the gate panel and stop. Through the rain and the camera grain, he could see the window going down, a figure leaning out. Female, dark hair plastered to her face by the rain. She was trying to enter the access code and getting it wrong. Nathan hit the intercom. "Harrow Ridge Security, can I help you?" A pause. Then, "Yes, I'm sorry. I'm a guest of the Harrow House, number 4. I'm... Another pause. Her voice had something in it. Not just the tight, clipped sound of someone annoyed at a malfunctioning keypad. Something else. Could you just let me in, please? My name is Elise Blackwood. He checked the list. The Harrow residence had 2 registered guests this week, a couple named Devereaux arriving Thursday, and an E. Blackwood listed as arriving today. He buzzed her through. As the gate swung open and the Mercedes pulled through, Nathan stepped out of the gatehouse without quite making a conscious decision to do so. The rain hit him immediately, cold and hard. He stood on the edge of the driveway and watched the car pass, and as it did, Elise Blackwood turned and looked directly at the camera mounted above the gate. Her face was white. Not cold white. Fear white. Nathan watched the Mercedes taillights disappear up the private road toward the main house loop. Then he turned back to the outer road, and that was when he saw it. A dark SUV parked about 150 yards back, well beyond the estate lighting, engine running. No headlights, just sitting there in the rain and the dark. He stood very still. A few years ago, a therapist he'd seen for about 6 sessions before he stopped going had told him that hypervigilance was a trauma response, that his brain had been recalibrated by years of operating in environments where threat detection was the difference between going home and not going home, and that the civilian world would never quite trigger the same levels of alert, and that this was good, and that learning to trust the lower stakes version of reality was part of the process. Nathan had nodded and scheduled the next appointment and then never gone back. The dark SUV sat in the rain with its engine running and no lights on. He went back inside and pulled up the rear camera feeds, cycling through the angles he had coverage for. The SUV wasn't doing anything, just sitting. That was almost worse. A car that moved was going somewhere. A car that sat was watching. He checked the clock. 9:47. He picked up his radio and called the overnight number for estate management and got the answering service, which meant Davis, the actual manager, was unreachable until morning. He left a message noting the stationary vehicle and recommending they pull the camera footage. Then he sat back on the stool and looked at the monitors. The SUV's headlights came on. It pulled forward slowly, without urgency, and stopped at the gate. Nathan was already moving before the request came through the intercom. He stood in the doorway of the gatehouse and watched the gate camera. 2 men in the front seats. The passenger window came down and a man leaned out. Mid-30s, short hair, the kind of physical build that didn't come from a gym membership but from something more purposeful. "Evening," the man said. His voice was pleasant, controlled. "We're with Ms. Blackwood's security detail. She may have forgotten to add us to the access list. We'd appreciate being let through." Nathan looked at the man for a long moment. "I'll need to verify that with Ms. Blackwood directly," he said. "Give me a few minutes." Something shifted in the man's expression, very briefly. "Of course," he said. Nathan stepped back inside and called the Harrow House landline. It rang 4 times before someone picked up. A woman's voice, slightly breathless. "Hello? Ms. Blackwood, this is the gate. I have 2 men out front who say they're your security detail. Can you confirm?" Dead silence. Not a thinking pause, a scared pause. "Ms. Blackwood, don't let them in." Her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Please, don't let them in." The call ended. Nathan set the phone down. He turned back to the gate camera. The SUV was still there, but the driver's door was now open. The driver was outside, standing at the back of the vehicle, and he was doing something with the rear lift gate. Nathan couldn't see what. He stepped out of the gatehouse. "Sir?" he called out. His voice carried clean and flat over the rain. "Sir, I need you to return to your vehicle." The driver looked up, the same controlled expression as the passenger. "Just getting something from the back," he said. "Return to your vehicle now." A pause. The driver looked toward the passenger seat, some calculation happening. Then he got back in. Nathan moved to the control panel outside and locked the gate manually, the standard card key override, which meant even a legitimate access code wouldn't open it without his intervention. Then he pulled his phone and dialed the county sheriff's non-emergency line, gave them the estate address, described the vehicle, described the men, and asked for a courtesy drive-by. The dispatcher told him someone could be there in 20 to 30 minutes. 20 to 30 minutes. He went back inside. The SUV hadn't moved. Nathan sat on the stool and looked at the monitors and did the kind of mental accounting that he hadn't done in 14 months. Entry points, the main gate, which was now manually locked, and the service access on the east side, which required a separate code, but which a determined person with the right equipment could defeat in under 90 seconds. The estate wall was 8 feet of concrete capped with iron, not unscalable. The main house was approximately 400 yards from the gate by road, shorter through the grounds. He picked up his radio and tried Davis's direct cell. No answer. He thought about Sophie sleeping at Mrs. Aldrin's house 2 miles away. He thought about the sound of Elise Blackwood's voice. Don't let them in, please. The SUV's headlights went off again. Nathan was standing before he'd made any decision about standing. His body understood the situation before his brain had finished processing it, the same way it always had, the same way it had in the Korengal Valley and on a rooftop in Mosul and in a dozen places whose names he no longer said out loud. Threat assessment happened in the spine and the chest before it ever reached the part of the brain that used words. He locked the gatehouse, pocketed the keys, and started up the private road at a steady jog. The rain was still coming hard. The private road curved through old oak trees before it opened to the circular drive in front of the main house. And in that stretch of maybe 200 yards, Nathan was invisible from the gate and invisible from the house. Deep, dark, and wet and alone, with just the sound of his own footfalls and the storm above him. He'd left his radio on his belt and his phone in his jacket pocket. What he didn't have was anything else useful. The estate's security staff was unarmed. Management had been very clear about that when he was hired. No firearms on premises. One of the conditions he'd accepted without argument because at the time it had seemed like a reasonable limitation for a man who was trying to become the kind of person who didn't need to be armed. Right now it felt like a less reasonable limitation. He came around the curve and saw the lights of the main house ahead. The Harrow place, a stone and glass structure that probably had a name and a history and a wine cellar. The circular drive was empty except for the silver Mercedes. Nathan moved off the road and came around through the garden path on the north side, habit moving his feet quietly without thinking about it. He saw the man before the man saw him. One of them had gone around. While the driver and passenger had kept Nathan occupied at the front gate, a third man had come over the east wall. Nathan spotted the section where he'd landed, a divot in the wet grass, boot-shaped. The man was moving along the east face of the house in a crouch, heading for the service entrance. Nathan stopped. He calculated the distance, 20 yards. The man hadn't seen him. He was focused on the door. Nathan stepped off the garden path onto the grass, and the wet ground swallowed his footsteps, and he moved across the space between them with the kind of absolute quiet that 14 months of security guard work hadn't taken out of him any more than it could take out the color of his eyes. He got within arm's reach before the man sensed something and started to turn. Nathan put him down fast and clean, no theater, no wasted motion. The man hit the wet grass, and Nathan had both his wrists secured behind his back with the flex ties he kept on his belt. Standard issue, the only thing close to useful equipment he'd been given, before the man had processed what had happened to him. "Stay down," Nathan said quietly. "Don't make noise." He left the man on the grass and moved to the service door and found it already compromised. The lock had been dealt with, the door standing slightly ajar. They'd sent the third man ahead before the conversation at the front gate. The entry team was already in position. The two at the gate were distraction. Nathan pushed through the service door. The house was dim inside, low lighting in the entry corridor. He moved through the kitchen, utility hall, following the layout he'd memorized across 14 months of delivering package manifests to the front desk. The main rooms were to the left, the staircase to the right. He heard a sound from the study, a crash, something breaking. He was through the study door in 4 strides. The second man had Elise Blackwood by the arm and was pulling her toward the window. She was fighting him, not panicking, not screaming, fighting, teeth, and free hand. And Nathan felt something register about that even in the middle of the moment. She wasn't a helpless woman. She was a woman in a genuinely dangerous situation doing what she could with what she had. Nathan didn't announce himself. Announcements were for situations where the goal was compliance. This wasn't that. He pulled the man off Elise and introduced him to the wall with enough force to put him out of the equation for the immediate future. The man slid down the wall and sat on the floor looking at nothing in particular. The room went quiet except for the rain against the windows and Elise's breathing. She was standing against the far wall, holding her arm where the man had grabbed her, staring at Nathan. Her hair was still damp from the rain. Her eyes were brown and very focused, and she was doing the same kind of calculation that Nathan had done at the gate. Threat assessment, exit points, trust or no trust. She looked at his uniform. "You're the guard," she said, "from the gate." "Yes." "You came up here?" "Yes." She looked at the man sitting unconscious on the study floor. She looked back at Nathan. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, which was too simple a word for the complicated thing happening in her face. More like the specific recalibration of someone who has been waiting to be let down and hasn't been. "There were more of them," she said. "2 at the gate and 1 in the garden. I have the one from the garden secured outside." He moved to the window and checked the view. The drive was still empty, which meant the front 2 were either still waiting or had moved. "Do you have a room with a lock?" "Interior, no windows." "The wine room, basement." "That works. We need to move now." He looked at her. "Can you walk?" "Yes." She said it like the question mildly offended her. "Then let's go." He followed her through the house, watching the angles, listening to the upper floors and the entry points as they moved. She led him down a back staircase to the basement. Stone walls, a heavy door with a proper lock, $3,000 worth of wine in racks along the walls, and a bench along the back. She sat on the bench. He checked the door, locked it, and stood. The rain was still loud even down here. Outside, distant but distinct, he heard the sound of a siren. The sheriff's drive-by, closer to 15 minutes than 20. Nathan exhaled. Elise Blackwood looked at him from the bench. She had her arms wrapped around herself, not from cold, from the act of holding things in that had been threatening to come out. He recognized the posture. He'd worn it himself for about 2 years. "Those men," he said, "you know who sent them." It wasn't a question. She held his gaze. "Yes." "You didn't call the police yourself?" "No." He nodded slowly. He didn't push it. There were reasons people didn't call police, and not all of them were suspicious ones. Some of them were the kind of reasons you carried quietly because explaining them to a stranger, especially a stranger in a cheap security uniform standing in your wine room at 10 o'clock at night, took more trust than the situation had built yet. "My name's Nathan," he said. "Nathan Cole." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "It's on your badge." "Right." Upstairs, the siren was getting closer. Nathan leaned against the wall across from her and looked at the locked door and thought about Sophie sleeping 2 miles away and about 3 men who'd come to this house tonight knowing exactly how to bypass a security checkpoint, and about the look on Elise Blackwood's face when she'd whispered, "Don't let them in." The particular texture of someone who had learned to be afraid of specific, known things. Not strangers, not random violence, something much more deliberate than that. He didn't know her story. He didn't know what she'd brought with her through that gate tonight. But standing in the wine room of a house that smelled like stone and old wood, listening to the rain work itself out above them, Nathan Cole felt something shift in him that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not the return of something dangerous, something more complicated. The feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be. The sheriff's deputy who showed up was a young guy named Reyes, early 30s, the kind of cop who still took notes by hand and asked follow-up questions and meant them. He walked through the house with a flashlight and a professional calm that Nathan respected, cataloged the damage in the study, called in the 2 men Nathan had incapacitated, and spent 40 minutes taking statements in the Harrow kitchen while the storm finished its business outside. The man from the garden had gotten loose. Nathan wasn't surprised. Flex ties worked on compliant people. The ground had been wet, the grass soft, and Nathan had prioritized the woman inside the house over the man outside it. He told Reyes this without apology, and Reyes wrote it down without judgment. The 2 from the SUV were gone. The SUV itself was gone. Clean withdrawal, no plates visible on any camera angle, executed in the window Nathan had spent securing Elise and moving through the house. Professional work. Not the kind of thing you hired from a Craigslist ad. Elise sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking and answered Reyes's questions in a flat, precise voice. Unknown individuals, no prior contact, no idea what they were looking for. She said it all without blinking, and Nathan, standing by the doorway with his arms crossed, didn't say anything about the whispered, "Don't let them in," or the way she'd said, "I know who sent them in the wine room." That wasn't his information to volunteer. Reyes looked at Nathan before he left. "You did good work tonight," he said. Then, after a pause, "What did you do before this?" "Navy," Nathan said. Reyes nodded, like that explained everything, which it did, and it didn't. After the deputy left, the house got very quiet. The storm had moved on and left the wet world smelling like damp stone and cut grass. Elise was still at the kitchen table. Nathan should have gone back to the gatehouse. His shift technically continued until midnight, but the gatehouse had been unoccupied for the better part of 2 hours, and nobody had called him about it, which meant the management answering service had passed his earlier message nowhere useful. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked up. "You don't have to stay." "I know." She looked back at the mug. A long quiet that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, just two people sitting with the remnants of a bad night. "You didn't tell the deputy what I said in the basement," she said. "No. Why not?" "Because you didn't tell him either, and I figured you had reasons." He paused. "You do have reasons." She turned the mug in her hands. "Yes. You don't have to explain them to me. I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. "Richard will hear about tonight by morning. He has people inside the county system. Not deep, not FBI level, just enough. A deputy's incident report, a name attached to a complaint. That's all he needs." Nathan didn't ask who Richard was. The name had the weight of something she'd been carrying a long time. "He sent them?" Nathan asked. She didn't answer right away. Outside, something dripped steadily from the eaves. "I can't prove it," she said finally. "I can never prove anything. That's the point. That's how he built everything." Nathan looked at her. The kitchen light was the overhead kind, unflattering, and in it she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with tonight. It was the tiredness of someone who'd been managing something exhausting for years and had gotten good at hiding it. "Go get some sleep," he said. "You're safe tonight. I'll stay until someone from management can get here in the morning." She looked at him like she was trying to figure out what category he fit into, what the angle was, what the cost would be. "I'm not being generous," Nathan said, reading it. "I'm doing my job. This is the job." Something almost relaxed in her face. Not a smile, just the lowering of something she'd been holding up. "Okay," she said. She went upstairs. Nathan went back to the gatehouse, reset the logs, called the overnight line, and left a more detailed message, and then sat on his stool and watched the monitors and the empty road until dawn came gray and slow over the tree line. He thought about 3 men who knew what they were doing. He thought about a woman who couldn't call the police. He didn't sleep. Estate management sent someone by 9 in the morning, a facilities coordinator named Greg, who walked through the damage in the study with a clipboard and a pained expression and said things like, "We'll need to loop in legal, and the Harrows are going to be very concerned about this." Nathan gave him the incident report he'd already written by hand, answered his questions, and was told he could take the rest of the day. He drove home. The apartment was a 2-bedroom in a complex that wasn't ugly but wasn't anything either. Beige walls, low ceilings, a kitchen that got afternoon light when the weather cooperated. Nathan made eggs and toast and sat at the table and ate without tasting it, which was a habit he'd developed sometime in year 2 of widowhood and hadn't broken. Sophie came home from Mrs. Aldrin's at 11. She came through the door with her backpack over one shoulder and a look on her face that said she was calculating something. "You look terrible," she said. "Good morning to you, too." She dropped her bag on the couch and came into the kitchen. 12 years old, dark hair pulled back in a messy way that she insisted was intentional, her mother's expression when she thought someone was underestimating her. She opened the refrigerator, looked at its contents, closed it again. "Did something happen at work?" "Quiet night," Nathan said. She looked at him. She had a way of looking at him that reminded him uncomfortably of being debriefed, patient, attentive, waiting for the thing you weren't saying. He'd never figured out if she'd always had it or if she'd developed it after losing her mother, this particular vigilance about what the adults in her life were leaving out. Mrs. Aldrin made actual pancakes this morning, she said, letting it go, with blueberries. She said you should come for dinner sometime. I'll think about it. That means no. It means I'll think about it. Sophie poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter and looked at him with the frank assessment of someone who had decided to love you exactly as flawed as you were, but wanted you to know she'd noticed. You should sleep, she said. You have that thing you do when you haven't slept, where you chew on the inside of your mouth. He stopped chewing the inside of his mouth. Go to bed, Dad. He went to bed. Minutes. He was back at the estate by 6 that evening. The study had been tidied, estate staff moved fast, and Elise was still there, which surprised him. He'd half expected her to be gone, checked out, moved to a hotel or a different property, or wherever people like her went when something went wrong. She was in the garden instead, sitting on a stone bench near the east wall, with a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading, staring at the grass where the third man's boot prints had left marks. The grounds crew hadn't gotten to that section yet. Nathan came around the garden path and she heard him coming and didn't startle, which told him something. Either she'd been listening for him specifically, or she'd gotten enough sleep to get her startled response back to baseline. Possibly both. You came back, she said. It's my shift. I thought they might reassign you after last night. Management seems mostly concerned about liability. He stopped a few feet from the bench. The garden smelled like wet earth and something that bloomed at night. How are you? I've been better. She closed the book. I've also been worse. She said it without drama, like a weather report. My arm is bruised where he grabbed me, nothing serious. You were fighting him when I came in. I was trying to. You were doing fine. She glanced up at that, checking for condescension, finding none. I took 3 months of Krav Maga 2 years ago, she said. My instructor told me I was too controlled. That real danger would unlock something. She paused. He was right. I bit that man's hand hard enough to draw blood. Nathan almost smiled. It was the first time in this whole situation he'd come close to it. She shifted on the bench. Sit down if you want. He sat on the far end of the bench, the proper professional distance. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Last night, the way you moved through the house, the way you handled them. That wasn't security guard training. She wasn't accusing him, just stating it plainly. What did you actually do? In the Navy? SEAL, he said. She absorbed that. And now you're working a gate. Now I'm working a gate. She didn't push it, which he appreciated. Most people pushed it, wanted the story, wanted the arc, the fall from the exciting thing to the quiet thing because it made better conversation. She just nodded and looked at the garden. My husband's name is Richard Blackwood, she said. You probably already looked him up. He had that afternoon before he'd slept. An hour on his phone scrolling through the kind of coverage that money generated. Business profiles, philanthropy columns, Forbes adjacency. Richard Blackwood was 51, founder and majority stakeholder of Blackwood Capital Partners, a private equity firm with fingers in logistics, tech infrastructure, and what the profiles vaguely called strategic consulting. Respected. Photographed at galas. The kind of man whose name got buildings named after it. I looked him up, Nathan said. Then you know what he looks like on paper. She turned the book over in her hands. Paper Richard is very impressive. Real Richard is something else. How long have you been married? 6 years. A pause. Together for 8. I was 22 when we met. He was 43. He was the most confident person I'd ever been in a room with. She said it without nostalgia, like she was describing a decision made by a different person. Confidence that size, when you're 22, it reads as security. It takes a while to understand what's actually underneath it. Nathan was quiet. He didn't hit me, she said, preempting something. I want to be clear about that. Richard is too intelligent for anything that leaves marks. What he did was, he built a world and put me in the center of it and then made sure every exit required his permission. My company, Elise Blackwood Inc., is technically mine. Built it myself over 7 years. But Richard structured the early financing through his own instruments, which means there's leverage embedded in the foundation that he can pull whenever he wants. She exhaled slowly. I've been trying to untangle it for 2 years, quietly, because if he knows I'm untangling it, he can collapse the whole thing before I have anything solid enough to survive on. The men last night, Nathan said, they were looking for documents, physical copies of certain financial records I've been compiling. I had them with me when I arrived. I brought them here because I thought this place was... She looked at the wall. I thought distance might help. Richard is based in the city. Are the documents safe? She looked at him. I had them on me when you took me to the basement, she said. In my bag. He nodded. Okay. Okay, she echoed, and there was something almost wry in it. That's your whole response, okay? You've got documents, they didn't get them, you're in one piece. For tonight, that's okay. She studied him. You're very calm about things that should be alarming. You get used to it. Doesn't that bother you, being that way? Nathan thought about it seriously, which he seemed to appreciate. Some days, he said. Mostly it just is what it is. The garden went quiet for a while. The evening light was doing something decent with the tops of the trees. You said you had a daughter, she said, last night when I asked if you had someone to call. You said you had a daughter. Sophie, she's 12. What's she like? He looked at the grass. Smart, he said, like uncomfortable smart. She reads everything and she remembers all of it, and she has opinions about things 12-year-olds usually don't have opinions about. He paused. She's also 12, so she's a disaster on an emotional level, but she's my disaster. Her mother? Car accident 3 years ago. Elise was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. Yeah. Another silence, different from the first. The specific texture of two people who had both lost things acknowledging each other's losses without making it a performance. I had a baby, she said, 3 years ago. Stillborn at 7 months. She said it in the same level voice she used for everything, but her hands tightened slightly on the book. Richard insisted on keeping the pregnancy private, so when it happened, there was no one outside the hospital who knew, no one to grieve with, no one who even knew to ask. She looked at the wall. I think that's when I stopped pretending, not in any way anyone could see, but inside, something stopped. Nathan didn't say he was sorry, because he'd just heard it said to himself and knew what it cost and what it didn't quite reach. Instead, he just sat with it, which was sometimes more than words anyway. You're not what I expected, Elise said finally. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone who'd ask fewer questions and follow more instructions. She glanced at him sideways. The gate guard who saved me was supposed to be a good night's sleep and a polite thank you. Not... She stopped. Not what? She shook her head, not ready for whatever the end of that sentence was. He stood up. I should do my rounds. Nathan. She said his name like she'd been deciding whether to. I want to hire you. Not through the estate. Directly. Personal security, until I can get out of here and back to the city with the documents safely. He looked at her. You've got money for that. I do. Estate management would probably have opinions about it. They can have opinions, she said. I'll pay what it costs. He should have said he needed to think about it. He should have said he'd talk to management first. He should have done the sensible, careful thing that a man who is trying to keep a low profile and raise a daughter without incident would do. I'll need to adjust my schedule, he said. I have a kid. I know. Bring her here if you need to. The estate has room. He looked at her for a long moment, and she held the look steadily, not asking for anything she hadn't already asked for, not performing more confidence than she had. I'll start tomorrow, he said. What Nathan couldn't have articulated at the time, wouldn't have wanted to try, because articulating things was not generally how he processed them, was the feeling that Elise Blackwood had walked into the estate that night carrying something he recognized. Not the danger, specifically. Not even the fear. But the particular quality of someone who had been operating alone in a difficult situation for so long that the aloneness had become structural, load-bearing, and they'd forgotten what it felt like to have another person in the equation. He knew that feeling like he knew the layout of a building he'd been inside 1,000 times. He told himself he was taking the job because it was a job, and the money was better than the estate management rate, and Sophie's school shoes needed replacing, and the car needed a brake job. These things were true. They weren't the whole truth. Over the next 5 days, Nathan settled into a rhythm at the estate that was different from anything he'd done in his 14 months there. He did the gate hours when he was scheduled, but increasingly the work was upstairs, walking the perimeter with a notebook, mapping the sight lines and the weak points, identifying the 2 camera blind spots that the intruders had clearly known about in advance, which continued to bother him. He replaced the east wall access code on his own initiative and submitted the change to management after the fact, and management sent an email that said please consult before making changes to access systems, which he acknowledged and ignored. Sophie came on Saturday. He'd asked Mrs. Aldrin to bring her by, and his daughter walked into the Harrow estate with her backpack and her book, and looked around at the stone and the grounds with the expression of someone doing rapid mental arithmetic. "This is not your job," Sophie said. "It's part of my job. You're living here. I'm working here." She gave him the look. He gave her the room that had been offered, the small one off the east corridor, actual guest accommodations, which were nicer than their apartment, and he could see her registering this and choosing not to comment on it with the kind of diplomatic restraint that occasionally surprised him. Elise and Sophie met in the kitchen on Saturday evening while Nathan was outside checking the east wall. He came back in to find them both at the kitchen table with Sophie's history textbook open between them, mid-argument. "The treaty didn't fail because of the terms," Sophie was saying. "It failed because the enforcement mechanism was the same countries who broke it. You can't have that." "You're completely right," Elise said. "I wrote a paper on that in college." Sophie looked at her with the recalibrated attention of someone who had been prepared to be condescending and was now uncertain. "What was your major?" "Economics and international policy. Double." "That's not useless," Sophie said, which from her was high praise. Nathan stood in the doorway and watched them and didn't say anything. It was the most normal 10 minutes he'd had in a long time. The surveillance car appeared on Wednesday. Nathan noticed it first on his morning perimeter walk. A gray sedan parked on the public road outside the estate boundary, just at the edge of the camera's useful range. Different from the SUV, different plates, different model. But the same quality of stillness, the same idling patience of something waiting rather than going anywhere. He photographed it on his phone and wrote down the plates. He didn't call Reyes yet. What he had wasn't a crime, just a car on a public road. But he started cross-referencing angles and discovered that the sedan's position gave a clean line of sight to the east garden where he and Elise had been sitting Tuesday evening. Someone had been watching them. Not from outside the estate, trying to get in. From a position that had been chosen specifically to observe without being immediately identified as a threat. The calculation was different from the first attack. Less violent, more patient. Which meant whoever Richard was running this through had recalibrated after the failure at the gate. They'd stopped trying to retrieve the documents by force. Now they were collecting information. Nathan sat with this for a while. He didn't mention it to Elise immediately, not because he was keeping things from her, but because he wanted to understand the shape of it first. The shift from active intrusion to passive surveillance was a specific kind of decision. It said something about the timeline they were working on. He called his contact, former teammate, now working private intelligence consulting outside Chicago, a man named Briggs whose legal activities Nathan tried not to ask too much about. He described what he'd seen, both incidents, and Briggs was quiet for a moment. "The professional entry team with prior knowledge of the security layout," Briggs said. "That's not contractor work, that's in-house." "Meaning?" "Meaning whoever Blackwood used, they had access to the estate security specs before the night. Gate override codes, camera placement, staff schedule. That's not research, that's a source." Nathan looked at the gate log in front of him. The staff schedule, the camera positions, the access codes, all of it had been in the estate management system for months, available to anyone with administrator credentials. "Someone on the inside," Nathan said. That's what it looks like, Briggs said. Watch your back, brother, and watch who's watching you. Nathan thanked him and ended the call. He sat in the gatehouse and looked at the monitor showing the empty public road where the gray sedan had been that morning. It was gone now. But that wasn't reassuring. Things that disappeared didn't stop existing. They just moved somewhere you couldn't see them anymore, and they kept watching, and they waited for you to believe the quiet meant safety. Nathan had learned a long time ago, in places with different kinds of danger but the same fundamental mechanics, that the quiet was often the most dangerous part. He locked the gatehouse door and started writing down everything he knew. The list Nathan made that night covered 3 pages of a yellow legal pad he'd found in the gatehouse desk drawer. And by the time he was done, it had the uncomfortable quality of something that made too much sense. Entry team with prior knowledge of the security layout, camera blind spots they'd navigated without hesitation. The gate override codes, the staff schedule, the east wall access, all of it institutional knowledge, the kind you only got from inside. He'd been at the estate 14 months, and in that time the management system had gone through 2 software updates, both of which had required staff to re-enter credentials, both of which would have generated access logs that an administrator could read. He went through the visitor logs for the 6 weeks before Elise's arrival. Nothing stood out. The usual delivery manifests, resident guests, maintenance contractors. He cross-referenced against the camera maintenance schedule and found something that bothered him in the low-grade, persistent way of a splinter you couldn't locate. The east wall camera had been serviced 8 days before Elise checked in. The technician was listed as a vendor Nathan didn't recognize. The work order had been signed off by the facilities coordinator, Greg, the man with the clipboard who'd come the morning after the attack and seemed mostly worried about legal liability. Nathan photographed the log page with his phone. He didn't sleep that night either, but this time it wasn't anxiety keeping him awake. It was the focused, specific attention of someone working a problem, and that feeling, familiar and uncomfortable and necessary, had a quality to it that was almost like being alive in a way the past 14 months hadn't quite managed. He called Briggs again at 6 in the morning. Briggs answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't slept either, which was its own kind of commentary on the lives they'd both built after the service. The vendor who serviced the East camera, Nathan said. I've got a company name, Meridian Tech Solutions. Can you run it? Give me an hour, Briggs said. It took 40 minutes. Meridian Tech Solutions had been incorporated 11 months ago in Delaware, a state whose incorporation laws asked few questions. Its listed principal was a man named Alan Fossey. Briggs had run Fossey through the databases he had access to and found him on the payroll of a logistics company called Corval Group, which was 3 corporate layers deep, a subsidiary of Blackwood Capital Partners. Nathan sat with that for a moment. He sent a man in to service the camera 8 days before she arrived, Nathan said. Either he knew she was coming, and when, Briggs said, or he had standing coverage on that property for a while. How would he know she'd be there? Does she have a phone, an email account, a car with GPS on? Briggs paused. A husband who controls her company's infrastructure? Nathan thought about what Elise had told him in the garden. Richard structured the early financing through his own instruments. If Blackwood Capital's technical teams had access to the company's foundational systems, access to a personal device registered to a company account wasn't much of a stretch. She's been surveilled, Nathan said, probably for a long time. That would be my read. He thanked Briggs and ended the call and sat in the gatehouse watching the morning come in pale through the glass. At 7:30, he walked up to the house and knocked on the kitchen door, and Elise answered it with wet hair and a coffee cup, and the expression of someone who had also not slept particularly well. He told her what he'd found, all of it. He put the legal pad on the kitchen table and walked her through it, and she sat across from him and listened without interrupting, which he was learning was how she processed things, fully, quietly, without performance. When he finished, she looked at the legal pad for a long moment. Meridian Tech Solutions, she said. I've never heard of it. You wouldn't have. It's clean on the surface. But you're saying Richard had this property covered before I even arrived. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. He knew where I was going. Yes. She nodded slowly. I told my assistant about coming here. She books everything through the company system. Is she trustworthy? Elise opened her mouth and then closed it again. the specific hesitation of someone recalibrating a certainty they'd been carrying. "I thought so," she said quietly. 3 years. It might not be her specifically. Could be the system itself. If his infrastructure team has access to the company backbone, your calendar is visible. She set down the coffee cup. Her hands were steady, which told him something. Not that she wasn't afraid, but that fear had stopped being new information for her a long time ago. "What do we do?" "We get the documents out of here and into the hands of someone who can act on them. Not county law enforcement. Reyes is good, but this is above his level. You need a federal contact or a serious private attorney with a forensic accounting background." He paused. "And we need to do it in a window they're not watching." She looked at him. "They're watching now?" "The gray sedan is back," he said. "East side of the public road. Different car from yesterday, but same position." She absorbed this. Outside the kitchen window, the estate grounds were quiet and green and deceptively ordinary. "You've been tracking them since Wednesday," she said. "You didn't tell me. I was trying to understand what they were doing before I said anything." She stopped. "That's either very professional or very frustrating. I haven't decided which." "Probably both." Something moved in her expression that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. Then it faded. "We need to go to Richard's office," she said. Nathan looked at her. "Say that again." "The documents I have are financial records. Cash flows, shell company structures, transfer records. They're damaging, but they're incomplete. Richard has a private office in the city, a secondary location he keeps separate from Blackwood Capital's official headquarters. I've been there twice in 8 years. He keeps physical files there. Original documents, not copies, not digital. The kind he keeps off system specifically because he doesn't trust electronic records." She held Nathan's gaze. "If we could access that office, that's breaking and entering. Yes. Which would make anything we found inadmissible in most contexts. Not if we photograph what's there and deliver the images to the right people with the right context," she said. "A federal investigation doesn't need our photographs to be the primary evidence. They need to know where to look. They need probable cause to look harder." She paused. "The photographs give them that." Nathan was quiet for a moment. He'd done things in his life that existed in complicated legal and moral territory, and he'd made peace with most of them because the calculus had been clear at the time. This was different. This was domestic, civilian, potentially criminal, in a jurisdiction where the rules were unambiguous and the consequences were personal. He was also looking at a woman who had been systematically stripped of every conventional option and was sitting across from him with steady hands and a clear head at 7 in the morning, and who had told him 2 nights ago that she'd spent years pretending her marriage was perfect while she quietly grieved alone and built something that was being used against her. "The office location," he said. "You know it." "I know the address. I've been inside. I know the layout of the front 2 rooms." She paused. "I don't know what room he keeps the files in." "Security system?" "I don't know the specifics, but Richard is cautious about visible security. He doesn't like things that announce themselves. Anything he has there will be discreet." Nathan thought about Briggs. He thought about a man named Garrett, who lived in Portland now and did ethical hacking consulting and owed Nathan a favor from a situation in 2019 that neither of them talked about. He thought about a very specific set of skills he'd told himself he was done using. "Give me 2 days," he said. Well, he didn't tell Elise everything he was doing in those 2 days. Not because he was hiding it from her, but because half of it was the kind of preparation that was better explained after the fact, when the outcome was known and the methodology was less relevant. He called Garrett. He spent 6 hours on reconnaissance, driving past the address twice at different times of day, photographing the building from public angles, identifying the security camera positions. The building was a converted brownstone in a commercial district that had gone upscale in the last decade, 4 stories, ground floor leased to an architecture firm, upper floors divided into private offices. Richard's suite was on the 3rd floor. The exterior camera coverage had 2 angles, both manageable. Garrett called back on the 2nd day with information about the building's security contractor, a firm called Apex Guardian Systems, whose equipment was good, but whose monitoring protocols had a specific vulnerability in the connection between the external camera network and the interior motion sensors. a gap of approximately 90 seconds during a system handshake that occurred every 4 hours. Predictable. Exploitable with the right equipment, which Garrett described and which Nathan sourced from a supplier in the city without any of it being technically illegal to purchase. He told Sophie he had an errand on Thursday night and arranged for her to stay with Mrs. Aldrin. Sophie looked at him with the familiar forensic attention and said, "Okay, but if something happens, call me first, not Mrs. Aldrin. She panics." "Nothing's going to happen." "Dad, call me first." "Go to bed before 10. She gave him the thumbs up. They went on Thursday night. Nathan drove, Elise in the passenger seat, the city moving around them in its ordinary nocturnal way. Late restaurants, cab lights, a group of college students at a corner. He wore dark clothes that weren't tactical, just dark, because theatrical preparation was both unnecessary and stupid. Elise wore a gray jacket and had her hair pulled back, and she was quiet the whole drive in a way that wasn't fear. It was the same focused quiet he'd seen in her at the kitchen table. She processed by going inward, and she came out the other side ready. He'd explained the timing window to her 3 times, not because she hadn't understood it the first time, but because he needed her to understand it precisely. 90 seconds from the moment he triggered the handshake gap to the moment the system resynced. That was the window to get from the exterior door to the 3rd floor without appearing on the interior sensors. After that, they were in a building with no active camera coverage of the interior. Apex Guardian system didn't cover the individual office interiors, only the common areas and exits. They parked 2 blocks away. At the building's service entrance, Nathan worked the lock in under 40 seconds. A physical skill that required no special equipment and that he'd never quite let go of the way he'd let go of other things. Elise stood at his shoulder and didn't make a sound. He triggered the handshake gap with Garrett's device, and then they were moving, up the service stairs, 3rd floor, the door to Richard's suite. The suite lock was a keypad. Nathan had a 6-digit range from Garrett based on standard Apex protocols. He tried the second combination on the list, and the pad beeped green. Inside. The suite was 3 rooms, a front reception area, a central office, and a back room with a closed door. The front 2 rooms matched what Elise had described. Nathan used a small flashlight with a red lens, moving it along the walls and furniture, getting the layout. "The back room," Elise said quietly. "He always kept it locked. I was never in there." The back room lock was a different animal, a keyed deadbolt, physical, no digital component. Nathan worked it for 90 seconds, and then it gave, and they went in. Floor-to-ceiling filing systems on 2 walls, a desk, a single leather chair. The desk had a locked drawer. The files were organized in a way that looked chaotic, but Nathan had seen this before. The deliberate disorder of someone who had memorized their own system and used the chaos as a barrier. He photographed systematically, drawer by drawer, file section by file section, moving the camera steadily without rushing. Elise worked alongside him, pulling files to photograph and replacing them exactly. 15 minutes. 30. They moved in near silence, the only sound the soft click of the camera and the ambient noise of the city outside. It was Elise who found it. She'd pulled a file from the back section of the second wall unit, unlabeled on the tab, the kind of deliberate mislabeling that meant something was there. She opened it and stood very still. "Nathan," she said. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before. Not fear. Something that required a moment to identify. He crossed to her. She held the flashlight over the open file, and he read what was in front of him. The file had his name on the first page. Nathan Cole. His service record, summarized in 3 paragraphs by someone who had access to things that weren't supposed to be accessible. His discharge date, his wife's accident, date, location, toxicology notes from the county report, Sophie's name, Sophie's school, his address. The second page was a timeline. His arrival at Harrow Ridge Estates. Not his application date, but his arrival, the day he'd first shown up for the job. The timeline went back further, a notation that said placement confirmed beside a date 14 months ago, a contact name below it. Greg Halloran, the facilities coordinator, the man with the clipboard. Nathan read the page twice. His chest was doing something he recognized from a long time ago, not panic, just the specific physiological response to learning something that rearranged everything you thought you knew. "Keep photographing," he said. His voice came out level. He didn't know how. He took the file from Elise and photographed every page. 12 pages total, his background, his psychological profile. See, someone had pulled his post-service evaluations, the ones that were supposed to be sealed, his relationship with Sophie, her school records, his financial situation, the car that needed a brake job, the note from some evaluation that said he demonstrated exceptional loyalty to protective roles and responds to vulnerability as a trigger for engagement. Someone had looked at Nathan Cole and seen a tool. Below the psych summary, a second name, not Richard Blackwood, a name Nathan didn't know, Hammond. D. Hammond. No first name, no title, just the name and a phone number with an area code he didn't recognize. He kept photographing. The drawer in the desk took 4 minutes to open. Inside was a secondary set of files, thinner, more recent. These were communications, printed emails, brief and coded but not coded enough if you knew what you were reading. References to the asset, which Nathan understood was himself. References to the package, the documents Elise had been carrying. References to a timeline for resolution of the Blackwood matter that had a date 2 weeks out. The last document in the drawer was a single page. It had Elise's photograph at the top, a professional headshot, the kind that ran in business profiles. Below it, a summary of her financial situation, the leverage Richard held, the shell instruments, the company backbone access. At the bottom, a handwritten note in a cramped script Nathan didn't recognize. She agreed to the approach. Cole was ideal. Confirm prior to extraction. She agreed to the approach. He stood there with the flashlight and the camera and read that line 4 more times. Then he put the file back in the drawer exactly as he'd found it and closed it and straightened up and turned around. Elise was standing at the far wall looking at him. She'd seen his face. She was good at reading faces. He'd noticed that about her, the attentiveness, the way she watched people. And she'd read his in the flashlight's dim red glow, and she knew what he'd found. "Nathan," she started. "We're done here," he said. "We need to go." He moved to the door. She followed. He reset the lock behind them, the back room, the suite door, the service entrance, all of it back to its original state, with the particular automated quality of someone whose hands were still working while his mind was somewhere else entirely. They got back to the car. He drove. She didn't try to talk to him for 6 blocks, which he was grateful for. Then she said, "Let me explain." "Not yet." "Nathan, not yet." He said it quietly, not angrily, but with the flatness that meant he needed time and wasn't asking for her opinion on whether he was entitled to it. She was quiet. He drove back toward the estate, and the city moved around them, and he thought about a file with his name on the first page and a timeline starting 14 months ago and the word placement. And the phrase "she agreed to the approach," and the way Elise had sat across from him in the kitchen with steady hands, telling him things she'd never told anyone, and the way it had felt to hear them, and the way his daughter had sat at the kitchen table arguing history with her, and how all of it, had a shape to it now that it hadn't had before, and the shape was a cage that had been built around him before he ever walked through the gate. He parked at the estate and turned off the engine and sat. "Tell me," he said. Elise was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing. Then, 18 months ago, a man named Hammond approached me through a third party. He represented, I still don't know exactly who, people who had interests in taking down Richard's operation. Not law enforcement, not anything official. People who'd been damaged by what Richard built and had the resources to dismantle it. She paused. They told me they needed someone with a specific profile inside the estate. Someone Richard's surveillance would read as harmless. A working-class veteran, single father, the kind of person Richard's analysts would file under not relevant. They'd identified you through your service record. "They identified me," Nathan said. "Yes." "And you... what? Signed off on it?" She exhaled. I told them yes because I had been trying for 2 years to get out from under Richard on my own, and I was running out of time and options, and I was... She stopped. I was desperate, and I told myself it wasn't using you because you'd be safe, and you'd be employed, and you'd never even know, and I could get what I needed, and you'd just go on with your life. But you'd know, Nathan said. Yes, she said. I'd know. He looked out through the windshield at the dark estate road. The night at the gate, he said. The storm. Were the men Richards or were they Hammonds? A silence that lasted long enough to be its own answer. I don't know, she said quietly. I've been asking myself that since the beginning. What does that mean? It means I don't know if the attack that night was real or if it was staged to create a situation that would... She stopped. Pull me in, Nathan said. Yes. He sat with that. The rain, the fear in her voice, the whispered, don't let them in, the way his instincts had brought him up that road to the house. How perfectly it had worked. Were you afraid that night? He asked. Actually afraid. She turned toward him in the dark of the car. Yes, she said. I don't know if the men were real or staged, but my fear was real, because by that point I didn't fully trust Hammond's people either. I didn't know what anyone was willing to do. She paused. When you came through that door, I don't know what I felt. Relief, guilt, both at the same time. Nathan looked at his hands on the steering wheel. Sophie's in that file, he said. Her school, her schedule. I know. Her voice broke slightly on the second word, just slightly. Nathan, I need you to understand. I didn't know they'd go that deep. Hammond's people gave me the outline. They didn't give me, but you knew they were running a profile on me. Silence. You knew they knew things about me, he said, and you let it go ahead. The silence stretched out and answered every question. Nathan got out of the car. He walked to the gatehouse and stood inside it and looked at the monitors without seeing them. The gate was closed. The road was empty. Everything was quiet. He was so tired. Not the tired of a sleepless night or a physical task, the older, heavier kind, the tired of someone who had rebuilt themselves carefully from the specific rubble of their own life and had just found out the new structure was standing on a foundation someone else had laid for their own purposes. He thought about Garrett's device and the photographs on his phone and the faces of the men in the SUV and the gray sedan on the public road. He thought about a name, D. Hammond, a phone number with an unrecognized area code, 2 weeks until whatever resolution of the Blackwood matter meant. He thought about Elise's voice when she'd said my fear was real. He thought about Sophie. He pulled out the legal pad and drew a line down the center of a clean page. On the left, he wrote what he knew. On the right, he wrote what he didn't know. The right side was longer, but the left side was enough. Richard Blackwood had leverage over Elise and was willing to use violence to maintain it. That was true regardless of how Nathan got into the picture. Hammond's people had used Nathan without his knowledge or consent, which was a violation he wasn't going to put a softer word on. That was also true. Elise had agreed to it, and then, somewhere along the way, something in her had changed. What started as a mission became something real. He didn't know if that was true. He didn't have the equipment to be certain, not tonight. But he'd looked at Elise Blackwood every day for more than a week. He'd watched her with Sophie. He'd watched her in the kitchen at 7 in the morning with wet hair and a coffee cup. He'd watched her in the garden, talking about a child who had no grave marker and no mourners because her husband had insisted on keeping the pregnancy private. He wasn't certain, but he wasn't nothing either. He picked up his phone and looked at the photographs from Richard's office. Hundreds of them. The files and the correspondence and the shell company structures and the evidence of years of calculated harm dressed up in philanthropy columns and Forbes profiles. And the file with his name on the first page. Nathan put the phone face down on the desk and looked at the empty road on the monitors. He'd spent 14 months being invisible. He'd spent 3 years trying to disappear into a quiet life because the alternative, being the thing he was trained to be, had a cost he wasn't sure he could keep paying. But the file with his name in it had been compiled before he ever chose to disappear. The cage had been built around the idea of him, and the question of whether to accept it or dismantle it had never actually been his until right now. He picked up the legal pad and turned to a new page and started writing. The new page stayed blank for a while. Nathan sat with the pen in his hand and the legal pad on the desk, and the monitors showing nothing, and let the night be what it was. He wasn't a man who journaled or processed things by writing them down in any emotional sense. The legal pad was for information, for logistics, for the structured thinking that had always worked better for him on paper than in his head. But tonight the pen didn't move because, for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what category to put things in. Betrayal was a word he'd used sparingly in his life. It required a specific combination of trust and intention. Someone had to have known what they were doing to you and done it anyway. He'd been betrayed by people he trusted in the service, once, in a way he'd never fully talked about, and had eventually made peace with through the simple passage of time and the understanding that people under pressure make decisions that damage others in ways they don't fully account for. This was different and also the same. Elise had looked at a plan that required placing a man without his knowledge and had said yes, and then she'd sat across from him at a kitchen table and told him things she said she'd never told anyone, and he didn't know how much of either thing was real, and that uncertainty had a specific weight to it that was different from simple anger. Anger he could work with. Uncertainty just sat there. He picked up the phone and looked at the photographs again. Not the file with his name, he knew what that said. The other files, the shell company structures, the transfer records, the coded correspondence. He'd sent copies to Briggs 6 hours ago with a request to identify the right federal contact, someone with jurisdiction and appetite, who wouldn't be in Richard's pocket. Briggs had 3 contacts in the relevant space and had been making calls since midnight. At 4 in the morning, Briggs called back. "I've got someone," Briggs said. "Her name is Calloway, Assistant Special Agent in charge out of the Financial Crimes Division. She's been building a parallel case on Blackwood Capital for 14 months, separate thread, different entry point, and she's been stalled because her primary source got spooked and went dark 6 weeks ago." A pause. "What you've got fills about 3 of the gaps she's been sitting on. Can she move fast?" "She can move faster than you'd expect if the material's what you're saying it is." Briggs paused again. "Nathan, the file with your name. You understand that's a problem for Hammond's people, not just Richard's." "I know. Whoever Hammond is, he built an operation around a civilian asset without consent. That's not legal even when the target is a bad guy." "I know that too. So what are you doing with that?" Nathan looked at the monitor. The gate was still closed. The road was still empty. In a few hours, the estate would start waking up. Groundskeepers, the kitchen staff for the main house, Greg Halloran with his clipboard and his administrator credentials and his name in a file in Richard Blackwood's private office. "I'm going to take it one thing at a time," Nathan said. He didn't go back to the house that night. He stayed in the gatehouse until 6, made coffee from the machine that barely worked, watched the dawn happen through the glass. At 6:15, he walked up the private road and let himself into the estate kitchen and started making eggs, because it was something to do with his hands and because he hadn't eaten since noon the previous day. He heard Elise come downstairs at 6:40. She came into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway when she saw him at the stove, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She looked like she hadn't slept either. She was wearing the same gray jacket from the night before, which meant she'd either slept in it or hadn't slept at all. "Sit down," he said. "Eggs are almost done." "Nathan?" "Sit down, Elise." She sat. He put the eggs in front of her and poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her, and for a while they ate without talking, the kitchen doing what kitchens do in the early morning, the particular functional warmth of a space designed for sustaining people. "I've been in contact with a federal agent," he said. "Financial crimes. She has an existing case on Richard. The photographs from last night could move that case forward significantly." Elise looked up from her plate. "I sent copies to an intermediary last night," Nathan continued. "The originals are on my phone. Calloway, the agent, wants a meeting, today if possible." "You moved on this?" Elise said. "After last night? After what you found?" "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because what's in those files is real regardless of how I got put in the position to find it," he said. "Richard's operation is real. The harm he's caused is real. I'm not going to sit on evidence because I'm angry at the circumstances." He paused. "I am angry at the circumstances. Those are 2 separate things." She held his gaze. Her eyes were tired and direct, and she didn't look away. "You should be angry at me," she said, "not the circumstances." "Me." "I know." "Are you?" He thought about how to answer honestly without either performing more forgiveness than he had or performing more damage than he'd actually sustained. "I'm working on figuring out what I am," he said finally. Right now, I'm focused on the problem in front of us. She nodded slowly. That was enough for now, and she seemed to understand it. What does the meeting with Calloway require? She said. She'll want your testimony. Your documents plus the photographs from last night, cross-referenced with her existing case material. She'll also want to know about Hammond. He watched Elise's face. Everything you know about who Hammond is and who he represents. Something complicated moved across her expression. Hammond's people helped me when no one else would. Hammond's people built a file on my daughter's school schedule, Nathan said, quietly, evenly. I'm not interested in protecting them. A long pause. I know, Elise said. I know you're right. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I'll tell Calloway everything. He called Sophie at 7. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been awake. Everything okay? She asked. Everything's fine. I need you to stay at Mrs. Aldrin's today. A pause. Dad? Sophie. You said that same thing the morning after Mom's accident, she said, when everything was not fine. He sat with that for a second. His daughter had a memory like a steel trap and the willingness to use it, and he'd known since she was about 9 that lying to her was both ineffective and counterproductive. There are some things happening that I need to finish up, he said. You're safe at Mrs. Aldrin's. I need you to stay there until I come get you, and I need you to not go anywhere else. And I need you to keep your phone charged. Silence on her end. The specific silence of a 12-year-old performing the adult act of accepting information she didn't like because she understood the situation required it. Okay, she said finally. I'll come get you tonight. Promise? He didn't make promises lightly, and she knew it. Yes, he said. Okay. A pause. Be careful, Dad. You're all I've got. He closed his eyes briefly. I know, baby. I know. Calloway arrived at the estate at 11 in a gray government sedan, which she drove herself without a partner, which told Nathan something about how she was handling this. She was mid-40s, lean, with the particular economy of movement of someone who had spent years operating in environments where efficiency mattered. She shook Nathan's hand without preamble and Elise's hand with a look that said she'd done her research on both of them. They sat in the estate dining room, which felt overly formal for the occasion, but was the room with the most exits and the least window exposure, which was how Nathan had chosen it. Calloway spent 2 hours going through the photographs. She had a laptop and a portable drive, and she worked through the material the way a doctor reads a chart. Quickly, without expression, occasionally making a note. When she got to the shell company structures, she stopped and looked up for the first time. These 3 entities, she said, pointing to her screen. We've been trying to locate the originating documentation for 14 months. 3rd filing cabinet, 2nd wall unit, back section, Nathan said. Red folder, mislabeled. She looked at him. You have a good memory. I was paying attention. She went back to the photographs. When she reached the file with Nathan's name on the cover page, she stopped for a longer moment reading, and then looked up at him with something that was professional and also, underneath it, not entirely untroubled. You understand that this is a separate matter from the Blackwood case, she said. Yes. The individual identified as Hammond, and whoever he represents, conducting an unauthorized civilian placement operation. That's something my division doesn't handle, but I can make sure it gets to the right people. I need something from you first, Nathan said. She waited. Sophie Cole, my daughter. Whatever investigation comes out of this, her name stays internal. She's 12 years old and she's in that file because someone decided to put her there as leverage. And I need your word that she doesn't become a public record in any of this. Calloway looked at him for a moment. I can't guarantee what becomes public during a federal proceeding, she said. I'm not asking about the proceeding. I'm asking about your people. What you control. She held his gaze. Within what I control, she said carefully. Yes, you have my word. He nodded. Calloway turned to Elise. The next hour was Elise's testimony. Structured, precise, everything she knew about Hammond delivered in the same level voice she used for everything, only occasionally faltering on details that were personal rather than operational. The child she'd lost. The years of managed isolation dressed up as a successful marriage. The moment 18 months ago when Hammond's representative had approached her and offered something that looked like rescue and turned out to be its own set of chains. Calloway listened without interrupting. She asked follow-up questions that were sharp and specific and non-judgmental. When it was over, she closed her laptop. I need 48 hours to move this through the right channels and get authorization for what comes next, she said. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you both leave this property. Richard knows she's here, Nathan said. I know. The surveillance vehicle on the public road has been logged as of this morning. She stood. Don't go anywhere that connects to your usual patterns. Pay cash for everything. Don't use your regular phones for any communication that matters. She looked at Nathan. Do you have somewhere to go? He thought for a moment. Yes. Calloway left the way she'd arrived, efficiently, without theater. Nathan watched the gray sedan go down the private road and through the gate and out onto the main road, and then it was gone. Elise was standing beside him. Where are we going? She asked. I know a place, he said. Briggs had a property 2 hours north, a hunting cabin his family had owned for 30 years, the kind of place that existed in no database connected to Nathan or Elise or anyone in the current situation. Nathan had been there twice, once for a weekend after the service, and once the winter after his wife died when Briggs had driven up, stocked the cabin with food, and spent 4 days not asking Nathan to talk about his feelings, which had been the most useful thing anyone did for him that year. He called Briggs from a gas station payphone, one of the 4 remaining payphones in the county, which he'd cataloged at some point without consciously deciding to, and Briggs said, take it, no question, the key was under the 3rd porch step. Nathan got Sophie from Mrs. Aldrin's first. He pulled up, and his daughter came out with her backpack and looked at Elise in the passenger seat and looked at Nathan and didn't say anything except okay, with the resignation of someone who had accepted that the full story would come later. The 3 of them drove north. Sophie fell asleep in the back seat somewhere around the hour mark, her head against the window, her book open and face down on her lap. Nathan drove and Elise sat in the passenger seat and watched the landscape change from suburban density to open country, and for a long stretch of that drive neither of them spoke. And it wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was 2 people in a car with a sleeping child, and a lot of unresolved things, and the shared understanding that some of those things needed more space than a moving vehicle allowed. Can I ask you something? Elise said eventually. Sure. What made you go up to the house that night, the night of the storm? She looked at the road ahead. You didn't have to. You could have called the sheriff and waited. That would have been the reasonable thing. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Probably. So why didn't you? He thought about how to answer honestly. Because waiting felt wrong, he said. Not procedurally wrong, just in my gut, it felt wrong. The time it would take, the window you'd have been alone in there. He paused. I don't always trust that feeling, but sometimes the feeling is all you've got, and the timing doesn't allow for second guessing. Was there any part of it that was about you? She asked. Not accusingly, genuinely. He glanced at her. What do you mean? I mean, you said you'd been invisible for 14 months, that nobody at that estate looked at you twice, and then a situation came along that needed exactly what you are. She held his gaze for a moment before looking back at the road. Was any of it about needing to be needed? He didn't answer right away, because the honest answer was complicated and she deserved the honest one. Maybe, he said finally. Probably some. I don't think that changes what the right thing to do was in the moment. No, she said. I don't think it does either. I just wondered if you'd ever said it out loud. Have you ever said out loud that you used me? He asked. Not harshly, the same quiet register she'd been using. Yes, she said. Last night, in the car. That was the first time. Yes. A pause. It won't be the last. I owe you more than one. He didn't tell her it was okay because it wasn't entirely, and she wasn't asking for that. She was just stating a fact she intended to live with honestly, and that the willingness to hold the uncomfortable thing without trying to make it smaller was something he respected even when it was directed at him. The cabin smelled like old wood and the particular mustiness of a place that had been closed for a month. Nathan opened the windows and Elise found cleaning supplies under the kitchen sink, and Sophie woke up from the car and immediately started exploring with the focused energy of a kid who'd been cooped up in an adult situation for too long and needed to move. "There's a dock," Sophie reported, coming back through the screen door, "and a canoe. And I'm pretty sure there's a raccoon living under the porch." "Leave the raccoon alone," Nathan said. "I wasn't going to bother it. I was just noting its presence." He made dinner from the supplies Briggs had apparently restocked recently. Pasta, jarred sauce, a bag of salad. Nothing inspired. Sophie set the table without being asked, which she did when she understood that the adults were managing something heavy and she was trying to make herself useful in the ways available to her. He'd noticed her do it the winter after her mother died, and seeing it again now did something quiet to his chest. They ate at the wooden table with the screen door open onto the porch and the lake visible at the end of the dock, going dark with the evening. Sophie talked about the history paper she had due next week and the raccoon situation, and a book she was reading about a woman who'd been a codebreaker in the Second World War, which she was recommending aggressively to Elise. "It's not boring history," Sophie said. "It's the kind where you get angry because nobody knew these people existed." "I'll read it," Elise said. She meant it. Nathan could tell by the way she said it, with attention rather than politeness. After dinner, Sophie took her book to the porch, and Nathan washed the dishes and Elise dried them, and that domestic ordinariness had a strange quality to it, like wearing someone else's clothes that fit better than you expected. "She's remarkable," Elise said quietly. "She is. She gets it from you. The way she assesses things. She looks at a room the same way you do." Nathan handed her the last dish. "She gets the stubbornness from her mother." Elise smiled. A real one, not the careful, measured version she used in public. It changed her face considerably. "What was she like, her mother?" He leaned against the counter. "Loud," he said. "In the best way. She had opinions about everything, and she delivered them at full volume, and she was right about most of them, which was both great and extremely inconvenient." He looked at the dish towel in his hands. "She laughed at things that weren't funny yet, like before the joke landed, she was already there. Sophie has that too, she doesn't let on." Elise listened. She had a way of listening that made people keep talking, not through any particular technique, but through simple attentiveness, the sense that she was actually receiving what you said rather than just waiting for her turn. "I felt responsible for the accident," Nathan said. It came out without much preamble, which surprised him. "The logistics of that night, she was picking me up from something I'd asked her to, a dinner I shouldn't have committed us to, and she was running late and the road was wet and—" He stopped. "Rationally, I know the accident wasn't my fault. I've known that for 3 years. It doesn't stop the feeling." "No," Elise said. "Knowing something rationally doesn't touch the feeling. That's one of the worst things about grief." He looked at her. "Did you grieve?" he asked. "After you lost the baby, with no one to do it with?" She was quiet for a moment. "I grieved in the car," she said. "In the car, alone, on the way to things. I'd give myself the drive there and the drive back, and then I'd get where I was going and be Elise Blackwood, CEO, wife of Richard, successful and fine." She folded the dish towel carefully. It's an incredibly efficient way to fall apart very slowly. From the porch, Sophie called in, "There are about 1,000 stars out here." "Don't fall in the lake," Nathan called back. "I'm not going to fall in the lake. I'm 12, not 6. Elise laughed, the real one again, and Nathan felt something ease slightly in the complicated territory between them. Not resolved, not simple, but slightly less like a weight, and slightly more like the first stage of something he didn't have a name for yet. Calloway called at 9 the following morning. Nathan stepped outside to take it, standing on the dock in the early light, with the lake flat and silver around him, and Sophie still asleep inside. "Authorization came through last night," Calloway said. "We moved faster than I expected because 2 of the shell company documents you photographed connect directly to an 18-month investigation that's been pending sign-off at the deputy director level. Your material provided the 3rd supporting thread." A pause. "Richard Blackwood was taken in for questioning at 6 this morning at his city residence. His attorneys are already involved, but the financial forensics team has been working through the night, and what they're finding is substantial. Nathan looked at the water. Greg Halloran, he said. Detained at 7:15. He's cooperating. Another pause. Nathan, the Hammond situation. I made 2 calls last night. The name connects to a private intelligence network that's been operating in a gray area for about 5 years. They're known to federal authorities, but not pursued aggressively because they've generally operated against legitimate targets. What they did with you represents a significant overreach even by their standards. She paused. Someone in their organization made a call that crossed a line. It's being reviewed. Reviewed, Nathan said flatly. It's the best I can offer right now. I know. He exhaled slowly. What about Elise? She's not a target. She's a witness and a victim of the Blackwood operation. Her cooperation last night she was comprehensive and honest, and it helped. A pause, and in it something that was as close to personal as Calloway apparently got. She told me about the child, the circumstances of that loss. I want you to know that's being handled with discretion. Thank you. One more thing, Calloway said. Your position at the estate, management has been notified of the investigation and your role in it. I suspect your working relationship with them is going to be complicated going forward. I figured. I'm sorry about that. Don't be, he said. It was a gate. He ended the call and stood on the dock for a while. The lake was very still. A bird moved across the far tree line. The morning had the quality of something that had held its breath for a long time and was just beginning to let it out. Inside the cabin, he heard Sophie wake up, the familiar sounds of his daughter moving through a space, the creak of the wooden floor, the sound of water running. Then her voice through the screen door, Is there coffee? Please tell me there's coffee. You're 12, he called back. You don't drink coffee. I'm 12 in a stressful situation. He turned and went back up the dock toward the cabin. Elise was on the porch steps, cup in hand, and she'd heard his end of the call and was reading his face with the attention she always brought to it. It's moving, he said. She nodded. Her expression was complicated, the particular mix of relief and grief that came with the ending of something that had also been, in some terrible way, the structure her life was built around. Richard's empire had been real and damaging, and it had needed to end. And also for 8 years it had been what she woke up inside of every morning, and there was nothing clean about any of that. What do we do now? She asked. Nathan sat down on the porch steps beside her. Not close, just beside her, in the vicinity of her. Now we wait for it to work, he said, and we figure out the rest after. Sophie came through the screen door with a glass of orange juice and looked at both of them sitting on the steps. I found orange juice, she said, which is better than coffee, if anyone's asking. She sat on the top step and opened her book and angled herself toward the light. Normal 12-year-old morning behavior, transplanted to an extraordinary set of circumstances with the particular adaptability of a kid who had already survived one of the worst things a kid could survive and had decided to keep going anyway. Nathan watched his daughter read. He thought about a file with her name in it. He thought about the people who had put it there and the people who had authorized the putting, and he knew that his anger about that wasn't going away anytime soon and probably shouldn't. He also thought about what it had produced. The evidence that was now in Calloway's hands, the case that was moving, the walls coming down around something that had needed walls coming down around it. He hadn't been the man in the file. He hadn't been Hammond's asset or Richard's problem or anyone's calculated resource. He'd been himself, stubborn and grieving and imperfect and caring too much. And he'd made decisions based on what he believed was right without asking anyone's permission. That, at least, was something nobody had planned. He picked up his own coffee and looked at the lake. The morning kept going. The federal case against Richard Blackwood moved with the specific momentum of something that had been gathering pressure for a long time and finally found its release point. Calloway had described it as moving faster than expected, which in federal terms meant weeks rather than months. But those weeks had their own texture. Slow in some places, violent in their speed in others. And throughout it all, Nathan and Elise and Sophie existed in a strange, suspended state at the cabin. while the larger machinery did what machinery does when it finally engages. Nathan followed the developments through Callaway's updates and through Briggs, who had sources inside the financial crimes community, and who called every few days with information that Nathan absorbed and mostly kept to himself. The shell company's structures had unraveled faster than Richard's attorneys could manage. The physical documents from the private office, cross-referenced with Callaway's existing case material and with the forensic accounting her team had been quietly building for 14 months, painted a picture that was both complicated in its details and entirely simple in its shape. Richard Blackwood had spent the better part of a decade using Blackwood Capital Partners as a vehicle for moving money through structures designed to be untraceable, funding operations that ranged from regulatory manipulation to outright coercion of smaller companies whose market positions he wanted. The logistics firms he controlled through the subsidiary layers had been used to manage the physical infrastructure of several of these operations: storage, transport, the movement of people and things that never appeared on any official manifest. Greg Halloran had cooperated fully within 48 hours of his detention. He'd been recruited by Richard's operation 3 years ago, before Nathan had ever arrived at Harrow Ridge, and his role had been exactly what Nathan had deduced: maintaining administrator access to the estate's security systems and providing updates on residents and staff that could be useful to Richard's intelligence apparatus. He'd identified Nathan as a potential asset based on Nathan's background appearing in a routine employment background check, and had flagged it to his handler. The rest had moved up the chain to Hammond's organization, which had then approached Elise. The full shape of it, when Nathan finally had all the pieces, was both more and less sinister than he'd imagined. More, because the scale of what Richard had built required genuine ruthlessness and a specific kind of intelligence that made it worse than simple greed. Less, because at its foundation it was the same old story. A man who had decided that the rules existed for other people and had spent years building an architecture of exception around himself, and had eventually, inevitably, built it high enough that the fall was going to be significant. Nathan didn't feel satisfied by any of this the way he might have expected to. Satisfaction required a cleaner resolution than the world generally provided. What he felt instead was something more like the end of a sustained tension, the slow release of something he'd been braced against without realizing it. Richard Blackwood was formally indicted on 11 counts on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after that night at the cabin. Nathan read about it on his phone, sitting on the dock while Sophie was inside making what she called breakfast, and he called a genuine fire hazard. The headline had Richard's photograph above it, the professional one from the philanthropy columns, and underneath it a caption that had the specific irony of a life's public image suddenly becoming its documentation of the distance between surface and fact. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at the lake for a while. Elise left 3 days after the indictment. She'd been at the cabin for the full 6 weeks, which had not been the original plan. The original plan had been a few days while Callaway's operation moved, and then a return to the city for Elise to begin the legal process of disentangling her company from Richard's financial instruments. But Callaway had recommended she stay dark and off her usual pattern until the indictment was formally filed, and the cabin was the arrangement they had, and so they'd stayed. 6 weeks in a 3-room cabin with a 12-year-old and a man she'd wronged in a complicated way produced, between Nathan and Elise, a relationship that was unlike anything either of them had experience with. They were not reconciled. That word implied a return to something, and what they had in the beginning hadn't been real enough to return to. They were also not strangers. They were something in the particular middle of that, 2 people who had spent 42 days in close proximity while the external circumstances were extreme, and who had arrived at a provisional understanding of each other that was honest precisely because it hadn't tried to be more than it was. They argued twice. Real arguments, not careful disagreements. Once about Hammond, when Elise defended the organization's intentions in a way Nathan found both understandable and completely unacceptable, and once about a smaller thing that was really about the bigger thing, the way arguments usually worked. Sophie witnessed part of the second one, coming in from the dock mid-sentence, and handled it by retreating to her room with her book and emerging an hour later as if nothing had happened, which was either wisdom or avoidance, and probably both. They also, in the ordinary accumulation of 6 weeks, did the unremarkable things that turned out to matter. cooked dinners together, divided by what each person was actually capable of, watched a thunderstorm from the porch that lasted 4 hours and was genuinely spectacular, had the kind of three-way conversations at the dinner table that happened when an adult who read everything and a 12-year-old who also read everything found a common topic and decided to argue it to exhaustion. Sophie recommended Elise 3 more books, all of which Elise read, and they discussed each one with the serious engagement that Sophie applied to things she cared about. Nathan watched this and didn't say much about it. What he noticed and said nothing about was how Sophie started to unfold in Elise's presence in a specific way. Not the way kids unfold around adults who try to entertain them, but around adults who treat them as worth talking to seriously. His daughter had been managing a grief that was too large for her age since she was 9 years old, and she'd done it with the particular stoic competence that he recognized as his own inheritance to her. And he loved her for it, and also knew it had cost her things that a 9-year-old shouldn't have to pay. What Elise did, without appearing to try, without making a project of it, was talk to Sophie about hard things directly and trust her to handle the weight of them. Loss. Decisions made badly. The difference between a mistake and a character flaw. Sophie, who had spent 3 years being carefully protected by her father from any implication that adults were fallible, received this information like someone who had been waiting for it. He watched it happen and was grateful and complicated about it in equal measure. On the morning Elise left, she was up before anyone else, her bag already packed, her car keys on the kitchen table. Nathan found her on the porch with coffee and the early lake light coming through the trees. He sat in the other chair. "You could have told me you were leaving today," he said. "I was going to. I'm telling you now." She looked at the water. "Early is easier. Goodbyes at dinner tables take too long." "Where are you going?" "City. My attorney has been working on the Blackwood capital leverage for 6 weeks. With the indictment filed, Richard's instruments lose most of their enforceability. It's going to be a legal process and it's going to take time, but the foundation of my company is actually mine again." She said it without triumph, just the stated fact of something she'd fought toward for a long time. "I'm also changing my name, going back to my birth name, Elise Marsh." She paused. Blackwood was always his more than mine. "Elise Marsh," Nathan said. "It sounds strange. I'll get used to it." She turned toward him. "I owe you an accounting of things. Not just an apology, but an actual accounting, because you're someone who thinks in specifics and generalities don't mean much to you." She held his gaze. "I agreed to a plan that treated you as a means to an end. I told myself it was acceptable because the end was just and because you'd never know. Both of those were rationalizations for something that was wrong. I've known it was wrong since approximately the 3rd day I actually knew you, and I kept knowing it and I kept not telling you, and that second part, the keeping, is worse than the first. What I did affected Sophie, her name in a file, her schedule, her life used as a data point by people she's never met. That's the part I don't know how to carry, and I won't ask you to tell me I should feel better about it, because you'd be right not to." Nathan was quiet for a moment. The lake was doing something gentle with the morning light. "You protected Sophie," he said. "When it mattered. Calloway told me, in the conversation you had with her when I wasn't in the room, you made Sophie the condition of your cooperation. Full testimony in exchange for her name being kept internal. It's not a trade-off," he said. "I know that. I'm not telling you it balances the ledger. I'm telling you I noticed." She looked at him. Her eyes were steady and a little tired and very honest. "What do you want?" she asked. "Going forward, from me, if anything." He thought about it seriously. "I want you to actually leave Richard behind," he said. "Not just legally. I want you to stop running the cost-benefit analysis on your own honesty, because that's something he taught you, and it's something you're going to have to unlearn on purpose." He paused. "And I don't know what I want with you, Elise. I know what it's not. It's not nothing, but I don't know what to call the rest of it, and I'm not going to call it something wrong because the timing felt convenient." She nodded slowly. "That's fair. When the legal work is done, and you're somewhere that's actually yours, when some time has passed and the ground is solid, then I'd like to have a conversation about what the rest of it is." He looked at her. "If you want that." I want that, she said, without hesitation, without performance. He nodded. She finished her coffee. She went inside and said goodbye to Sophie, who had apparently woken up and been listening from the hallway. Because when Nathan came back in, his daughter was hugging Elise with the unselfconscious thoroughness that she usually reserved for things she'd decided mattered to her. You have to come back, Sophie said into Elise's shoulder. I need to argue the second half of that book with someone who actually read it. I'll read it twice, Elise said. Her voice had something in it. She let Sophie go. She picked up her bag. She looked at Nathan one more time in the way she'd looked at him in the gatehouse camera the night of the storm, directly, without filtering it. And then she walked to her car and drove down the dirt road through the trees and was gone. Sophie stood beside Nathan on the porch. She's coming back, Sophie said. It wasn't a question. I think so. Are you going to let her? He looked at his daughter. When did you get opinions about my personal life? I've always had them, she said. I've been waiting for your personal life to exist so I could have them about it. She went inside, letting the screen door bang behind her. I'm making eggs. Don't argue with me about how I make them. He stood on the porch and listened to the morning sounds, and after a while, he went inside. They stayed at the cabin 2 more weeks. Nathan had called estate management from the payphone on the second day and been told by a voicemail that his position was under review pending the conclusion of the investigation, which he'd interpreted correctly as a professional severance delivered with institutional cowardice. He left a message acknowledging the message and didn't call back. He'd expected to feel something about losing the job, but what he mostly felt was the absence of feeling, which told him the job had been exactly what he'd always known it was: shelter, not purpose, a thing to be inside of while he figured out what came next. He'd been inside it for 14 months and now it was done, and the question of what came next was no longer avoidable. He talked to Briggs about the private security consulting work that Briggs had been suggesting for 2 years, and that Nathan had been declining for 2 years. He listened this time in a way he hadn't before, which Briggs noticed and mentioned. What changed? Briggs asked. I'm tired of the gate, Nathan said. You were always too much for the gate. I needed the gate for a while. And now? Nathan looked at the lake through the cabin window. Sophie was on the dock reading, her feet dangling above the water, her hair in the same messy arrangement she insisted was intentional. Now Sophie needs to get back to school, he said, and I need to actually build something. He took the consulting work. The first contract was a risk assessment for a mid-sized financial firm that needed someone to audit their physical security infrastructure. No combat, no weapons, nothing that required him to be anything other than the person who knew how buildings worked and how people moved through them and where the gaps were. He did it well. He knew he did it well because the firm paid him for a second contract before the first one was finished. It wasn't the gate and it wasn't the service. It was something in between that fit the person he'd become rather than the person he'd been, and fitting mattered more than he'd understood when he was 26 and operating at the edge of everything. Sophie started at a new school in September. It was 40 minutes from the lakeside rental they'd found in the first week of August. A small house on a quiet road, actual land around it, a dock that wasn't as good as the cabins but was theirs. Sophie had chosen her room with the window that faced the water, which she called her reading light, and which Nathan privately thought was the best view he'd ever given her. The new school was smaller than the old one. A month in, Sophie reported that the history teacher was good and the math teacher was bad, and there was a girl named Okafor who had also read the Codebreaker book, and they'd had an argument about it at lunch that had apparently formed the basis of a friendship. She's wrong about the 3rd chapter, Sophie said at dinner, but she's wrong in an interesting way. That's a good quality in a friend, Nathan said. I know, I'm keeping her. He watched his daughter talk about school, normally, animatedly, with the specific energy of someone who had been cooped up in an adult situation for 2 months and was now returned to the texture of her own life, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, which was too simple and too fragile. More like solidity, the sense of a foundation under the day that wasn't borrowed or temporary or built on something else's schedule. He thought about his wife sometimes, and it still hurt, but the hurt had changed again in the months since the cabin. It had become something he could hold at a slight distance and look at honestly. The love that was real and the guilt that was real, and the way both of them had coexisted in him for 3 years, as if they were the same thing, when they weren't. The accident was not his fault. He'd known this rationally for a long time. He was beginning to know it in the other way, the harder way, where the knowledge actually reached the place where the guilt lived and started to negotiate with it. He didn't know if that ever finished. He suspected it didn't, that it was the kind of work you did indefinitely at varying intensities, and he'd made a kind of peace with the indefiniteness. Elise called for the first time in October. Not a text, a call, which felt intentional. "My name legally changed 2 weeks ago," she said when he answered. "Elise Marsh." "How does it feel?" "Strange? Good. Like wearing your own clothes after wearing someone else's for a long time." A pause. "The company is mine. Fully, cleanly. It took 4 months of legal work and approximately the GNP of a small country in attorney's fees, but the leverage instruments are dissolved. Richard's financial instruments don't touch anything that belongs to me anymore." "Good," Nathan said. "I also found a therapist." She said it the way people said things they'd arrived at through difficulty. "Someone who specializes in the particular thing I spent 8 years inside. She's not kind in the warm way. She's kind in the accurate way, which turns out to be what I need." "I'm glad." "I talked about the baby," Elise said. Her voice changed on the second word and then steadied again. "Properly. For the first time. With someone who made space for all of it instead of just the professional parts." A longer pause. "I cried for about 3 sessions in a row. It was extremely undignified." "Grief usually is." "Yes." A breath. "How's Sophie?" "She has a friend. They argue about books." "That's perfect for her." "I know." A silence that was comfortable in the way silences between people who have been through something together can become comfortable, given enough time. "Nathan," she said, "you said when the ground was solid." "I know what I said." "Is it?" "For you." "Is the ground solid?" He looked out the kitchen window at the dock and the water going dark in the October evening. "Getting there," he said honestly. "Not all the way, but more than it was." "Me too," she said. "More than it was." "Elise." "Yes." "Come for Thanksgiving," he said. "Sophie's going to cook something terrible and insist it's good. And I'm going to agree with her, and you can come and witness that and tell me what you actually think of the house." She laughed. The real one, the one that changed her face. He could hear it even over the phone. "I'll bring wine." "Sophie will tell you that you didn't need to bring anything and then drink the cranberry juice." "I'll bring cranberry juice. She'll appreciate that more than the wine." "I know," Elise said. "I know her." He stood in his kitchen after the call ended and the line went quiet, and the house made its small sounds around him. The heat coming on, Sophie's footsteps above, the particular acoustic signature of a space that was becoming familiar in the slow and unglamorous way that familiarity actually built itself. He thought about what he would tell someone, if someone asked, about the last year of his life. He thought about the version that was a story. The storm, the gate, the men in the dark, the file with his name. And then he thought about the other version, the truer one underneath, which was about what happened when a person spent long enough trying to become invisible and then got visible again against their will and found out that they were still the same person they'd always been. He hadn't survived the last 14 months because he'd hidden himself well enough. He'd survived it because he'd been put in a situation where hiding wasn't an option and had discovered, on the other side of that he didn't actually want to hide anymore. That was maybe the thing about being someone trained for extremity. You could build a quiet life, and the quiet life could be real and valuable and genuinely chosen, but you couldn't build it on the premise that the other thing was gone. It didn't go. It waited. And the question wasn't whether it would surface again, but what you did with it when it did, whether you let it be used by someone else's design or whether you picked it up yourself and pointed it at something you actually believed in. He'd been someone else's asset, and he'd been his own worst damage, and he'd been, for 14 quiet months, a man at a gate. None of those was the whole truth of him, The whole truth was messier and less resolved and ongoing in the way that real things were ongoing, without the clean finality of a chapter ending. Sophie came downstairs at 7:30. She came into the kitchen and looked at his face and did the familiar calculation. "Good call?" she asked. "Good call." She opened the refrigerator. "Elise?" "Yes." "Is she coming?" "Thanksgiving." Sophie closed the refrigerator with a satisfaction that she tried to make look casual. "Good," she said. "I have a lot more books to discuss." "That's not the only reason." She looked at him with the clear-eyed assessment that sometimes made him feel like the child in the room. "No," she said, "but it's a reason." She got out the ingredients for something she'd been attempting to make for a week and failing at in instructive ways. "Are you okay, Dad?" "Actually okay." He thought about the question the way she'd asked it. Not perfunctorily, not the way people asked it in passing, but actually, the way his daughter asked things, with the expectation of the real answer. "Getting there," he said. The same words he'd used on the phone. They were still true. "Me too," she said. She started doing something ambitious to an onion. They stood in the kitchen together, father and daughter, in the house that was becoming theirs in the particular cumulative way that time made a place familiar. The water was dark outside. The house was warm. The onion was not going well. "Can I help?" Nathan asked. "No," Sophie said. "I've got it." She didn't have it. He watched her not have it for another minute and then took the knife gently out of her hand without asking again. "Move over," he said. She moved over. He cut the onion the way he'd learned to cut things in a field kitchen in another life, efficiently and without ceremony, and Sophie stood beside him watching and not saying that she could have done it, because she was 12 and stubborn, but she was also honest enough to know when she needed to let someone help. That was its own kind of growing up, Nathan thought, the willingness to let someone in without calling it surrender. He'd taken a long time to learn that. He was still learning it, in the way you kept learning the things that mattered long after you thought you'd finished. Every morning, a new chance to practice. Every evening, an accounting of where you'd managed it and where you hadn't. And the patient ongoing work of being the kind of person your own life was worth building around. The onion was cut. Sophie took it back with the proprietary confidence of someone who'd been watching and was now ready to apply the lesson, and Nathan stepped back and let her, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary smell of something being cooked. Outside, the lake was quiet. Down the road, Mrs. Aldrin had her light on. 2 states away, in a city apartment that was hers in every sense the word could hold, Elise Marsh was presumably doing the equivalent thing, making something from what was left, putting one honest day after another, finding out who she was without the architecture of someone else's control defining the walls. And in a federal facility, the legal process was doing its slow, unglamorous work on a man who had believed long enough that he was exceptional to the rules of ordinary consequence that he'd forgotten those rules didn't actually require his belief to function. None of it was clean. None of it was finished. The anger about Hammond's operation hadn't resolved itself into forgiveness, just into something colder and more permanent that Nathan kept in a separate room of himself and checked on periodically. The guilt about his wife still visited, still needed to be talked to in the way he was learning to talk to it. Sophie still woke up some nights and came and stood in his doorway, not asking for anything, just needing to know he was there, which he always was and always would be. The scars were real. The damage had happened. That was the thing about truth. It didn't retroactively clean up the events that had preceded it. It just meant you were standing in an accurate place when you looked at what came next. What Nathan knew, standing in his kitchen at 7:45 in the evening watching his daughter burn something with tremendous confidence, was that he was in an accurate place. He'd been a SEAL, and he'd been a husband, and he'd been a man broken open by grief, and he'd been a guard at a gate, and he'd been someone else's tool, and then he'd been none of those things, and all of them, which was closer to the truth of any person than any single label allowed for. He was a father. That was the one that held everything else inside it, the one he'd been worst at in the early years of grief and best at in the ways that mattered, the one that gave the rest of his life its actual shape. He was also, it turned out, still someone who walked toward the door when things got dangerous. He'd tried to leave that behind and it hadn't left. He understood now that it was not a liability, not a thing he needed to be protected from or that needed to be put away. It was part of the architecture of who he was, and the question was never whether to have it, but what to point it at. He'd pointed it at Elise when she was afraid in the dark. He'd pointed it at Sophie every day for 3 years. He'd pointed it at the truth when the easier thing would have been to walk away. That was enough to build something on. Outside, the wind came off the lake and moved through the old trees at the water's edge, and the dock creaked once, the way docks did in the evening, settling into the night. Sophie announced that dinner was almost ready. Nathan set the table.